In the thin, frozen air over central Germany in 1943, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses clawed forward at 25,000 feet, straight into a wall of black flak. Explosions punched holes through aluminum skin. One engine burned, its smoke streaming backward like a signal flare. Inside the cockpit, oxygen masks frosted over with each breath, and the steady vibration of 4 Wright Cyclone engines was broken by sudden shudders. Below them was enemy territory. Around them, German fighters circled, waiting for one aircraft to falter. Every instinct drilled into a pilot screamed the same command: break away, save yourself, get clear. The Luftwaffe depended on that instinct. A lone bomber was a dead bomber, isolated and easy prey for head-on cannon fire or a slow, methodical kill from the rear. Falling behind meant burning alive, bailing out into captivity, or vanishing without a trace. Yet this crew did not scatter. They held their position in a formation so tight the prop wash rattled the cockpit glass, and the wingtip of the next aircraft felt dangerously close. To observers, it looked reckless. To many commanders, it was madness. So why would anyone choose to fly like this, into lethal airspace? To understand why that formation existed, the story must rewind years before the first flak burst over Germany, to the culture of the pre-war United States Army Air Forces. These were not fighter aces chasing glory, they were crews, pilots, navigators, engineers, and gunners drawn from ordinary civilian life, farm boys who knew engines from tractors, factory workers comfortable with machinery, mechanics who trusted metal more than theory. They did not think in terms of heroics, they thought in terms of survival. During training flights over the Southwest and the English countryside, patterns began to emerge. Gunners noticed something simple and unsettling. When aircraft drifted closer together, their fields of fire overlapped. A fighter attacking one bomber suddenly faced guns from 2, sometimes 3 directions. When formations loosened, the opposite happened. Individual aircraft became isolated targets, and simulated attacks ended quickly and brutally. There was no single inventor and no official memo. The idea formed quietly, crew by crew, through repetition and loss. Early missions flown in loose formations proved disastrous. Bombers strung out across the sky were picked apart methodically, just as German doctrine intended. Crews who survived carried the lesson back with them. What emerged was not a theory, but a shared instinct. Ordinary men confronting extraordinary danger began to sense that closeness, not separation, might be the only way through. That instinct would soon collide with doctrine, hierarchy, and fear, long before anyone was willing to admit it was saving lives in the skies over Europe. Resistance came swiftly, and it came from above. Senior officers, schooled in pre-war theory and haunted by peacetime accident reports, saw tight formations not as innovation, but recklessness. To them, bombers flying wingtip to wingtip were mid-air collisions waiting to happen, flying coffins stacked one mistake away from catastrophe. Doctrine favored spacing, flexibility, and individual aircraft safety, even as individual aircraft were being destroyed in alarming numbers. Training manuals reinforced that belief. Regulations warned against prop wash, wake turbulence, and loss of control at altitude. Instructors drilled crews to keep distance, to trust separation over cooperation. When bomber groups experimented with closing ranks, reprimands followed. Reports were filed. Commanders worried less about German fighters than about explaining an accident to a board of inquiry. This was the heart of the conflict. On paper, collisions were unforgivable. An enemy shoot-down could be blamed on combat. A collision was human error, a stain on careers. The bureaucracy rewarded caution, not adaptation. As a result, lessons learned in blood lagged behind policy written in ink. Meanwhile, the reality over Europe was merciless. Scattered formations gave Luftwaffe pilots exactly what they wanted: isolated bombers, predictable approaches, clean firing passes. Crews understood this intuitively, but intuition carried little weight against rank. The men flying the missions found themselves trapped between experience and authority. Every instinct told them that staying close meant staying alive. Every order told them to spread out and hope. It was a system built to prevent accidents, even if preventing accidents meant losing the war in the air. And in that widening gap between rules and reality, the seeds of change were sown, waiting for desperation, loss, and undeniable numbers to finally force the institution to listen to the men it sent into the sky, under fire every single day there. By late 1943, the skies over Europe had become a crucible of steel, fire, and human endurance. Daylight bombing missions stretched hundreds of miles into enemy territory, with B-17 flying fortresses cutting a path toward factories, rail yards, and oil refineries. German defenders were relentless. The Luftwaffe had perfected head-on attacks, exploiting the bombers' frontal vulnerabilities, while squadrons of Bf-109s and FW-190s circled to strike from above, below, and behind. Each assault was coordinated with precision. Tracers stitched glowing webs across the sky, and 20 and 30 millimeter shells tore through aluminum with deadly consistency. Losses mounted quickly. On some missions, 10% of the bombers never returned. For crews on standard tours of 30 missions, the math was brutal. Even the most skilled pilots and gunners faced a statistical certainty. Unless something changed, entire squadrons would be wiped out before completing their service. The calculus was clear, cold, and unforgiving. A single gap in formation, a stray bomber, or a moment of hesitation could cascade into disaster, a chain reaction of death and aircraft lost. Commanders faced a stark dilemma. Continuing the existing doctrine meant accepting losses as inevitable, yet spreading wings too far apart only amplified vulnerability. Crews understood the stakes intuitively. Each man knew that survival required more than skill. It required trust, coordination, and innovation under fire. The problem was immediate, the danger existential, and the solution had to emerge from those who lived and breathed the peril of high-altitude combat. In that boiling cauldron, the lessons of experience clashed with rigid policy, setting the stage for a tactical evolution that would save hundreds of lives and redefine the way bombers fought in the air. The solution that emerged from the crucible of 1943 was deceptively simple in concept, but exacting in execution: the combat box. Imagine a medieval shield wall, row upon row of soldiers presenting points of defense toward any attacker. Now, lift that image into the sky, replace spears with machine guns, steel with aluminum, and you begin to grasp the essence of this innovation. B-17s were arranged in staggered altitudes, wings overlapping slightly so that every bomber's defensive fire covered the blind spots of its neighbors. The geometry was precise. Horizontal spacing ensured no aircraft collided in turbulence. Vertical separation allowed gunners to fire unobstructed, and the staggered wedge patterns meant every arc of incoming attack was intersected by multiple streams of bullets. Conventional wisdom had favored loose formations, giving pilots flexibility and reducing the chance of mid-air collision. On paper, the risk of crash outweighed the threat from fighters. In practice, this spacing left individual bombers exposed, isolated, and hunted like prey. One straggler or misaligned aircraft could invite concentrated enemy fire, often with fatal results. The genius of the combat box lay not in technological innovation, but in disciplined coordination. By clustering planes, crews transformed vulnerability into collective resilience. Every B-17 became both shield and weapon, a node in a network that amplified defensive power far beyond the sum of its parts. Risks remained tangible. Prop wash from wingmen constantly buffeted cockpits, turbulence threatened to disrupt alignment, and a single lapse of attention could trigger a collision. Flying closer demanded split-second reactions, unwavering trust, and near-obsessive adherence to visual cues.
Yet, despite these dangers, the pattern offered far higher survival odds. The paradox was clear. Individually, each bomber was no safer. Collectively, the formation was almost untouchable. The combat box also solved the problem of defensive coverage against head-on attacks. German fighters approaching in tight, coordinated strikes now encountered intersecting streams of .5 caliber bullets from multiple angles. Attempting to isolate a single bomber became nearly impossible, forcing attackers to retreat or risk destruction. In essence, the combat box converted the mundane physics of spacing and angles into a life-saving machine, a testament to the practical ingenuity of men who learned from experience rather than blind obedience. By rigorously applying this system, crews achieved a new equilibrium between danger and survival. Precision, discipline, and mutual support replaced luck in isolation. What had once been considered reckless madness became a structured, repeatable strategy. A living, breathing shield wall suspended 25,000 feet above Europe, capable of defending hundreds of young men against the most lethal air force in the world.
Control towers and squadron commanders pored over gun camera footage, searching for flaws, expecting disaster. Pilots adjusted their aircraft to maintain precise spacing, wings aligned within mere feet, altitude staggered just enough to allow gunners clear lines of fire. Every crew member was hyper-aware. One misstep could produce a catastrophic mid-air collision. As the B-17s approached German airspace, something remarkable began to emerge. Enemy fighters circled, probing for openings, but the dense, interlocking lattice of defensive fire slowed their attacks. Pilots reported that strafing runs were met by overlapping .50 caliber bursts from multiple bombers, forcing attackers to break off sooner than in previous raids. Stragglers were fewer, and isolated losses dropped significantly. One aircraft that might have fallen in a traditional loose formation returned with only minor damage, thanks to the mutual coverage of neighboring bombers. The numbers were modest but meaningful. Casualties decreased, formations remained intact, and morale quietly improved. Commanders who had predicted immediate catastrophe were forced to acknowledge, however grudgingly, that this mad idea had merit. It was not a panacea, and planes still sustained damage, but for the first time, the combat box proved itself in the unforgiving crucible of real combat, transforming theory into measurable survival. The initial success of the combat box did not go unnoticed. Within weeks, the Luftwaffe adjusted its tactics, sending waves of Bf-109s and FW-190s armed with heavier cannons and experimental air-to-air rockets to exploit any weakness. Approaches became coordinated and relentless, head-on attacks, flank strikes, and sweeping passes designed to isolate single bombers. The sky over Europe became a chaotic battlefield, smoke and tracer fire cutting through the thin October air at 25,000 feet. Yet the bomber crews adapted. Pilots instinctively tightened spacing, relying on visual cues and the subtle shadow of a neighboring fuselage to maintain formation. Gunners, some wounded but still conscious, held their positions and tracked overlapping arcs of fire, covering blind spots their comrades could not see. One B-17, its left wing torn by flak, remained in formation, its crew struggling to stabilize the controls, their survival made possible by the concentrated defensive lattice around them. Another bomber limped home with engines failing, shielded by the protective geometry of the combat box. The discipline required was exhausting. Turbulence, smoke, and the constant roar of engines tested every ounce of training and nerve. Decisions that would have taken seconds now demanded instantaneous precision, and each crew member's focus determined life or death. Chaos persisted, but the formation itself absorbed the impact, transforming what could have been catastrophic losses into survivable engagements. Losses continued, but now at levels that allowed squadrons to return intact, crews to continue flying, and lessons to compound. The combat box was no longer a theoretical experiment. It was a living system, tested and refined in fire. Commanders began to recognize the subtle brilliance of the tactic, the way ordinary men had turned cooperation and instinct into a quantifiable defensive advantage. In the crucible of the sky, ingenuity met discipline, and for the first time, survival felt like something earned, not hoped for. By the spring of 1944, the results were unmistakable. On missions over the industrial heart of central Germany between March and May, squadrons flying the combat box formation recorded a dramatic drop in losses. Where previous raids had seen up to 20% of B-17s shot down, tightly packed formations reduced casualties to under 10%. One mission involving 70 aircraft through dense flak and multiple fighter waves returned nearly intact. Every bomber, every crew member accounted for. Hundreds of airmen who, by previous calculations, would have been lost, now survived to fly again. Over months, thousands of lives were preserved, directly attributable to the disciplined geometry of overlapping firepower and mutual support. What had been dismissed as reckless madness had become a statistically proven method of survival. The combat box did not just work, it turned vulnerability into a calculable advantage, delivering exactly the payoff the crews and their silent ingenuity had promised. In the weeks following the proven success of the combat box, the atmosphere within the command structure began to change. Senior officers who had once derided tight formations as mid-air coffins could no longer dismiss the evidence. Reports and gun camera footage forced a reluctant acknowledgement. Disciplined proximity worked. Training manuals were quietly updated, specifying altitude stacking, lateral spacing, and coordinated squadron tactics as standard procedure. Among the crews, conversations shifted from whispered doubt to measured recognition. Men who had once flown with fear now understood that survival had depended less on individual heroics than on synchronized collective discipline. Mockery faded, replaced by a sober respect for the quiet innovation born in the cramped cockpits of aluminum fortresses. Pilots and gunners exchanged nods over intercoms, acknowledging instincts validated by results. The very planes that had once been dismissed as vulnerable now formed living shields, each supporting the other with calculated precision. What had begun as a subtle act of defiance against rigid doctrine became a validated practice, a triumph not celebrated with fanfare, but with the quiet satisfaction of a strategy proven in the harshest crucible of war. In this shifting tide, the underdogs had claimed their vindication. The combat box did more than just reduce immediate losses, it bought crucial time. By keeping bomber groups intact during the most perilous raids of 1943-1944, it allowed long-range P-51 Mustang escorts to reach deep into German airspace, further protecting vulnerable aircraft and tipping the strategic balance. The principle of overlapping fields of fire, mutual support, and strict formation integrity became more than a tactical innovation. It evolved into a foundational doctrine for modern air combat. Today, fighter and bomber squadrons alike continue to train in coordinated, layered formations that trace their conceptual lineage directly to those B-17 crews. Yet the men who pioneered this practice rarely received medals or formal recognition. Pilots returned to civilian life as engineers, mechanics, or farmers. Gunners returned to factory floors or mail routes. Their heroism went largely unnoticed outside their squadrons. But the lives they preserved, hundreds, ultimately thousands, endured as a silent, powerful testament. Museums house a few surviving B-17s, their aluminum skins etched with countless missions, standing as physical reminders of both ingenuity and courage. In the end, the story of the combat box is not about fame, but about discipline, foresight, and the quiet triumph of ordinary men over extraordinary danger. It is a lesson in how small, calculated adjustments can ripple through history, saving lives and shaping history. Reshaping warfare long after the guns have fallen silent, the shadow of their innovation stretches into every coordinated flight that follows, a testament to the invisible geometry of survival. Innovation rarely arrives wrapped in glory. The combat box was neither flashy nor celebrated. It looked cramped, perilous, and counterintuitive to every pilot trained in traditional doctrine. Yet within that rigid, overlapping lattice of bombers, hundreds of lives were preserved. Ordinary men, ordinary crews, surviving against the odds through cooperation and trust. The lesson endures. Brilliance often hides in discipline, foresight, and the willingness to act together when fear whispers to scatter. These are the stories history almost forgot, yet they shaped the course of war in ways medals and monuments cannot fully capture. By sharing them, we honor the quiet ingenuity that saved lives and altered tactics forever. Join us in preserving these overlooked moments. Comment with your own family's history, share stories that deserve to be remembered, and subscribe to continue uncovering the hidden victories that defined bravery in ways the world rarely sees. Together, we ensure these lessons and the lives they saved are never lost.